right, so who would win in a fight, Batman or Superman?
Yeah. It's a question that never really gets old, does it?
It really doesn't. But today, on this deep dive, we're going beyond just the fight.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond the muscles and capes.
Right, getting to the core of why these two icons, why their rivalry has captivated us for, what, like almost a century?
Absolutely.
So to really understand all this, we're diving into a podcast episode called
Oh, yeah.
Batman versus Superman Clash of the Titans.
Great episode.
It is.
Really gets into, like, what makes these characters tick.
Yeah.
And why their dynamic is just so interesting.
Totally. And one of the first things the podcast points out is how different their, like, origin stories are.
Right from the start.
Superman, he explodes onto the scene.
Literally explodes.
In 1938, Action Comics, #1.
Yeah, the OG superhero.
He really is. Like,
Yeah.
paved the way for the whole genre.
Totally. And his origin story is, like, so ingrained in our culture.
Alien from a dying planet lands in Smallville.
Gets raised by these, kindly farmers.
Becomes the ultimate symbol of hope.
Right. And I think the podcast makes a great point about how Superman really taps into this deep human need, this, like, need for a savior.
Oh, interesting.
Someone who represents pure good.
Okay.
Can overcome any obstacle. It's almost like mythological, right?
Yeah, like he just, like, embodies this sort of, this ideal. Right.
And it's no coincidence, right, that he emerged when he did.
Oh, what do you mean?
The late 30s, right? The world was on the brink of war.
Yeah.
There was so much uncertainty. People were looking for something to believe in.
So Superman was like the perfect hero for that moment in time.
Exactly. And then just a year later, you have Batman.
1939, Detective Comics, #27.
Completely different vibe.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a contrast.
Darkness, tragedy.
Right. He's driven by the trauma of losing his parents.
Right. Dedicates his life to fighting crime, but in the shadows.
Yeah. The darkness of Gotham.
And here's the key difference. No superpowers.
It's all grit, determination.
Intellect, training, technology. He's the ultimate self-made hero.
Yeah. If Superman is like this inherent goodness, Batman represents like the potential of the human will.
Totally. Like, no matter how bad things get, we can overcome them.
That we can rise above.
Right. And the podcast really gets into how this core difference fuels their rivalry.
Okay, so it's more than just like punches and heat vision.
Or way more. Superman, he embodies morality, right?
Okay.
Pure justice, almost like a force of nature.
I'm Batman.
He's all about strategy, meticulous planning. He uses his intellect to outmaneuver his opponents.
So their conflict is like philosophical too.
Totally. It's not just about who's stronger, but about whose approach to justice is more effective.
Or even like more human.
Right. And the podcast brings up some really interesting examples of how that plays out in their, like, iconic clashes.
Okay, like what?
Well, they talk about The Dark Knight Returns.
Oh, yeah. Frank Miller's classic from '86.
Grizzled, older Batman takes on Superman in this dystopian future. What a story.
I love that one.
Yeah.
What did the podcast say about it?
Well, they argued that it's not just a fight. It's like a commentary on power and control.
Ah, interesting.
Superman, he represents this almost authoritarian figure. Batman is the rebel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The idea that even a god can be challenged.
So it's like their ideologies clashing in this like super brutal physical way.
Exactly. And they contrast that with World's Finest Comics.
Oh, where they team up.
Yeah, you see how even when they're on the same side, their methods clash.
Oh, so it's like even with a common goal.
There's that friction.
Right.
Their worldviews, they just rub up against each other.
Yeah, like even when they're working together.
It's always there.
That tension is just
simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah, I get it. It's like they might respect each other.
Totally.
But their approaches are just fundamentally different.
Inevitably, they're going to bump heads.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's what makes their dynamic so compelling.
Makes you think. It does.
And it's so interesting how all of that tension plays out when you look at, like, the movies.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, you can't talk about Superman on film without talking about Christopher Reeve.
Yeah.
1978, Superman, the movie.
Such a classic.
It really was. Like, it defined the superhero movie for a whole generation.
Totally. And the Versus podcast, they actually talk about how Reeve, like, perfectly captured that early Superman.
Oh, interesting. How so?
That sort of, like, bright idealism.
Yeah.
That pure, unwavering belief in humanity.
Yeah. He was so earnest.
Exactly. And it worked, right? It was the perfect Superman for that time.
Yeah, he set the standard, for sure. But then, just a few years later, you have Tim Burton's Batman.
1989.
Yeah, and it's a totally different world, right?
Oh, way darker. more gothic.
Like almost like psychological thriller vibes?
Totally. And I think that reflects, like, how the understanding of Batman was changing.
Oh, okay.
He was becoming more complex,
Mm.
more like psychologically driven.
The podcast makes the point that Burton's film really tapped into this growing fascination with
Oh,
anti-heroes.
I see what you mean.
These flawed but compelling figures, they operate outside the lines.
Yeah. They're not squeaky clean, which makes them, like, more interesting in a way.
Right.
It's like you kind of root for them, even though they're doing things that are maybe a little morally questionable.
Right, exactly. And then, fast forward a few years, and you have Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy.
Oh, man. Talk about taking that darkness even further.
Gritty realism. Grounded. Believable.
Yeah. Batman felt more human, more vulnerable than ever before.
Right, and the podcast argues that this reflects, like, a larger trend in superhero movies. As audiences got more, like, sophisticated,
Yeah,
they demanded more complex characters, more nuanced stories.
I can see that.
That old school, purely good, unconflicted hero.
Like the Superman that Christopher Reeve played.
Right, it just wasn't resonating as strongly anymore.
It's almost like Batman on screen reflects how our cultural values have shifted.
Yeah, I think so. Like, away from that simple good versus evil,
Right.
towards a more ambiguous, morally gray world.
It's like we've become more aware of the complexities of the world.
Absolutely. And, the podcast even brings up Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice.
Oh, yeah, the 2016 movie.
Super divisive.
Oh, yeah. Some people loved it. Some people hated it.
But it definitely sparked debate.
Oh, big time. What do the podcasts say about it?
Well, they argue that the movie really tried to grapple with these evolving ideas about heroism.
Okay.
Like, it forced us to confront the potential consequences of Superman's power.
Right. Like, what happens when a godlike being has that much power?
Exactly. And the podcast points out that it also makes us question Batman's methods.
Like, how far is too far, even if you're trying to do the right thing?
Right. They argue that Batman v Superman isn't just a fight, it's a philosophical clash
Okay.
about power, justice, the line between hero and vigilante.
It's like, are Superman's ideals even sustainable in the world we live in now?
Right. And can Batman's methods ever truly bring about lasting change?
Yeah. And those aren't easy questions to answer.
Not at all. And the podcast makes a great point that these questions, they reflect the anxieties of our time.
Oh, I see. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just a comic book story. It's about real-world stuff.
Right. Like how we view authority, justice, the role of individuals in society.
Wow, that's a really insightful connection.
Yeah,
It makes these characters feel even more relevant today.
I think so too.
So we've talked about the past, but what about the future? Like, how is this legacy continuing to shape modern interpretations of these characters?
Well, they touch on that too.
Okay.
For example, Robert Pattinson's The Batman.
2022. That was a dark one.
Super gritty, yeah.
Like almost a detective story.
Right. The podcast highlights how that film really leans into Batman's detective skills.
Oh, yeah. He was like a brooding, obsessive investigator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the upcoming Superman Legacy.
2025. Can't wait to see that one.
I know, right? The podcast speculates that it might try to bridge the gap
What do you mean?
between that classic, idealistic Superman
Okay.
and the more complex, morally ambiguous world we live in now.
That's a tough balance to strike.
For sure. But it's what makes these characters so fascinating.
Yeah, they can be reinterpreted, reimagined to reflect the changing times.
And that's why their rivalry, their contrasting worldviews, I think they'll continue to captivate us for generations to come.
Yeah, it's like they represent these fundamental tensions that are always present in society.
Exactly. These ongoing debates about power, justice, what it means to be human.
It's incredible to think that two characters created over 80 years ago can still spark such relevant, thought-provoking conversations.
I know, right? It's because their stories tap into something universal.
You're right. Man, we've covered so much in this deep dive. I mean,
Okay.
Batman versus Superman, it's like, it's more than just a fight, you know?
Yeah, way more. And it's amazing how these characters, they just keep resonating with us.
Yeah, after all these years. And one of the things that really struck me from that Versus podcast was like how they force us to confront our own values.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, who are we more drawn to? What does that say about us?
Right. Like we talked about Superman, right?
Yeah.
He's all about hope, believing in the good in people.
Yeah, that unwavering faith.
But can you really be that optimistic? I mean, the world it can be a pretty dark place.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Like, is Superman's idealism, is it naive? Or is it something we should all strive for?
Right, right. And the podcast, they made the point that, like, even if it's not always realistic, maybe that hope, maybe that's what we need, like a reminder that things can get better.
That there's always something worth fighting for.
Yeah, I can see that. But then you have Batman, who's like the opposite, right? He embraces the darkness. He's prepared for the worst.
Always vigilant.
Yeah, he's seen how bad things can get, and he's ready to fight back, even if it means breaking the rules.
Mm.
And the podcast talked about how that kind of heroism, it comes from a different place, right?
Totally. It's born out of trauma, loss, but it's still heroism.
It's like, you don't have to be born with superpowers to make a difference. You can overcome anything, even the most horrible experiences.
And that's a powerful message.
It really is. So it's like with Batman and Superman, it's not just about like who would win in a fight. It's about like which approach to life, which approach to justice speaks to you more.
Exactly. Are you Team Superman holding on to that hope, or Team Batman facing the darkness head on?
Yeah. And I think that's what the podcast was getting at too. It's not about picking one side or the other. It's about like recognizing that both perspectives are important.
We need Superman's idealism to inspire us, to give us something to reach for.
Okay, yeah.
And we need Batman's pragmatism to keep us grounded, to remind us that the world can be a tough place.
Like they balance each other out.
In a way, yeah, like two sides of the same coin.
That's a good way to put it. They make us think about what it means to be heroic in a world that's not always black and white.
Exactly. And I think that's the beauty of these characters and why their rivalry, it just keeps going. It forces us to ask ourselves tough questions, to examine our own beliefs.
And figure out, like, what kind of hero we want to be.
Right. And so as we wrap up this deep dive, I got to ask you and all our listeners out there the same question the podcast asked. Which hero's approach resonates more with you and why?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have a definitive answer.
Yeah.
But I think that's okay.
Exactly. Because ultimately, whether you're Team Superman, Team Batman, or somewhere in between, this rivalry reminds us that there's no easy answers, no one right way to navigate the world. There's just the choices we make, the actions we take, and the impact we have. And that's a pretty powerful legacy to leave behind.
Absolutely. Well said.